On my 75th birthday, a day I hadn't even planned to make a big deal about, my sister Vivian suddenly looked at me across the long dinner table and smiled in a strange way before asking, "So, are you enjoying your $500,000 trust fund?" I stared at her, completely confused because I had no idea what she was talking about, and when I finally asked what she meant, my voice came out shaky and uncertain. My son Reggie froze, his fork stopping midair, and his wife Chelsea turned pale, and in that moment I knew something was very wrong. Vivian looked straight at them and asked, in her firm and serious voice, what they had done with the money, and the silence that followed felt heavy and full of secrets. Suddenly, my birthday dinner didn't feel like a celebration anymore, but more like the beginning of a painful truth coming to light. I sat there in their beautiful house, surrounded by expensive plates and shining glasses that had never belonged to me, feeling more like a guest than a mother. I was 75 years old and Reggie had insisted on hosting this dinner in his big home, and I agreed because even at this age, a mother still hopes for a little love from her child. My name is Delilah Ames and I grew up in a place where women were taught to stay quiet and accept everything without complaint, and I married young, raised 2 children and lost my husband 5 years ago. Since then I've been living alone in a small 1-bedroom apartment, getting by on a modest pension that barely covers my basic needs, while my son lives in a large 3-story house with a wide lawn and a swimming pool, and that night for the first time, I began to understand that something in my life had gone very wrong. My daughter-in-law Chelsea always dresses in expensive brands and changes her car every couple of years, and my grandchildren go to private schools where 1 month of fees costs more than several months of my rent, and I truly believed they had earned all of it through hard work. I never questioned it because I thought my job was already done when I raised my children, and I didn't want to be a burden. But that evening when Vivian spoke those shocking words, something deep inside me finally shifted, as if my eyes had opened for the first time. Vivian Ellington is my younger sister, now 70 years old, living 2 states away, running her own successful consulting business and traveling often, always dressed neatly and carrying herself with confidence. We don't meet very often, not because of bad feelings, but because our lives went in very different directions as she built a career and I built a family, or at least that's what I believed. She arrived that night with a beautifully wrapped gift and an expensive bottle of wine, hugged me tightly and said I looked well, even though we both knew I looked tired and worn down. She sat beside me and talked about her work and her travels, while Reggie and Chelsea smiled in a forced way across the table, and my grandchildren stayed upstairs, busy with their own worlds. The talk felt stiff and empty, full of pauses no one knew how to fix, until Vivian refilled her glass, looked at me seriously and said she had been wondering about something for a long time. When she casually asked if I was enjoying my $500,000 trust fund, it felt like time stopped, my head started ringing, and I couldn't make sense of what she was saying, so I stared at her and quietly asked what trust fund she was talking about, barely hearing my own voice as I spoke. Vivian's face tightened as she looked straight at me and said the trust fund my husband had arranged before he passed, the one I was supposed to be living on, and in that moment it felt like the room shifted under my feet. I had never heard a single word about it, never seen any papers, never received any payment, not once, and when I told her I knew nothing about it, my voice shook and my eyes filled with tears. Vivian gently but firmly set her glass down, and her warm expression disappeared, replaced by the serious no-nonsense look she used in business. Then she turned to Reggie and Chelsea, who suddenly looked stiff and uneasy, and asked them in a calm but sharp voice what they had done with the money. Reggie tried to laugh it off and said there must be some mistake, but Vivian stopped him right away and said she had been there when my husband signed everything, that she had witnessed it herself, and that the papers clearly stated there was a large trust set up for me with regular payments for the rest of my life. Chelsea jumped up and rushed out of the room with a weak excuse, while Reggie stayed frozen, unable to look at me, and in that quiet, heavy moment, everything became clear to me without anyone needing to say another word, and I finally understood where their comfortable life had come from and why I had been struggling for so long. When Reggie started to speak in that soft, nervous tone he used as a child, I raised my hand and stopped him because I wasn't ready to hear excuses yet. I needed time to think, to breathe, and to understand what was happening. And that was when Vivian took out her phone and said she was calling Elias Carter, the lawyer who handled the trust, because he had all the records, all the papers, and every answer we were about to need. Reggie's face lost what little color it had left and he quickly said that calling the lawyer was not needed, but Vivian calmly told him that it was absolutely necessary and finished dialing anyway, while I stayed sitting there, staring at the food I hadn't touched, my thoughts spinning in every direction. The number kept repeating in my head like a drumbeat, because the truth was my husband had left me a large amount of money, and yet I had been living on less than a small monthly income, skipping meals, wearing old clothes, and feeling like a burden to my own child, all while he had been using what was meant for me. The tears came without warning and I couldn't stop them, not from sadness but from shock, hurt, and a deep sense of being deceived that cut straight through my heart. Vivian squeezed my hand gently and told me the lawyer was on his way and that everything would be made right, and for the first time that night, I felt someone was truly on my side. Reggie sat stiff and silent, and Chelsea still hadn't come back, and what was supposed to be a birthday dinner had turned into something heavy and uncomfortable, with me realizing far too late how much had been kept from me. To understand how I ended up in that chair feeling so small and confused, you have to know the kind of woman I had always been, the one who took care of everyone else first, who served and listened and stayed quiet, who never asked for much and never complained because that was how I was raised and how I lived my whole life. My husband Jeremiah passed away 5 years earlier from a sudden heart problem, and he had always been a steady, hard-working man who handled all the money and paperwork while I trusted him without question, signing wherever he told me to. We lived a simple life that I thought I understood, and when he was gone, I felt lost and unsure of everything, and that was when Reggie stepped in and said he would take care of all the arrangements, all the accounts, and all the details, and at the time I believed him without a second thought. After my husband passed, Reggie took control of everything and told me he would handle all the papers and speak to the lawyers, and he explained in a serious voice that his father had left some unpaid bills and that the monthly money I would receive would be very small. So he said the family house had to be sold to cover those costs. I didn't argue because I didn't understand these things and I trusted my own son, so I agreed to whatever he said without doubting him. Soon after, I moved into a tiny apartment far from everything I knew, with one small bedroom, a cramped kitchen, and a bathroom that always seemed to have something broken, and even though the rent was low, my small monthly income meant I had to count every coin. I bought the cheapest food, walked instead of using transport, and kept the lights off as much as possible just to make the money last. Reggie came to see me about once a month, always in a hurry and always looking at his phone, and he would give me a little cash and say that was all he could manage, and I would thank him as if he had done me a huge favor, even though that small amount decided whether I could eat properly or not that week. Chelsea almost never came with him, and when I did see her, she looked at me in a way that made me feel like I was no longer important, just something old that people didn't quite know what to do with. My grandchildren hardly spoke to me, and when I was invited for holidays, they would disappear to their rooms filled with expensive things while I sat alone in a huge living room that didn't feel like it belonged to me. I looked around their large, beautiful house with its shiny floors and fancy furniture and listened to Reggie talk about business and plans, and I honestly believed he was simply more successful and more capable than we ever were, never once imagining that the life he was living had been built with money that should have been mine. Meanwhile, my own days passed quietly and slowly, waking up early with nowhere to go, drinking weak coffee to save money, and watching people outside hurry to their jobs and busy lives while I sat there feeling like my own life no longer had a purpose. Most days, I cleaned my little apartment even when there was nothing left to clean, and I kept the television on shows I didn't even like just to hear another voice in the room. I cooked simple meals for myself and stretched the leftovers for days, trying to make everything last as long as possible. The neighbors were polite but busy with their own lives, and to them I was just the quiet older woman in apartment 203 who always said hello and never caused problems, even when I had to sell the last pieces of my jewelry just to pay the rent. My only real friend there was Pet, who lived next door and had also lost her husband, but her life was different because her children called her every day, visited often, and even paid for her trips, and I couldn't help feeling a little jealous even though I never said it out loud. She noticed how rarely my son came, how I wore the same clothes again and again, and how sometimes I cried at night, and one afternoon over tea she told me gently that I had spent my whole life staying quiet and accepting everything, but that no one ever rewards a person for suffering in silence, and that one day I would need to stop accepting what was hurting me. I laughed it off and said I was fine, that my son did what he could, but she just looked at me and said that she hoped I would wake up before it was too late. After that, memories kept coming back to me of working extra jobs to pay for Reggie's school papers, of sitting up all night when he was sick even when I didn't have money for a doctor, of selling my wedding ring to help pay for his studies, and also of how as he grew older he slowly started to pull away, stopped introducing me to people, asked me not to come near his school because he felt embarrassed, and even at his wedding placed me far in the back like I didn't really belong. I always told myself this was just how life works and that children grow away from their parents, and I kept repeating the same sentence in my head again and again, that I didn't want to be a burden, even though that word had followed me for far too many years. That I kept telling myself I didn't need anything more from them, that they had already done enough and that I was fine on my own, but deep inside I knew those were just stories I repeated so I wouldn't have to face the truth. The real truth was that my son had left me emotionally long before he ever touched my money, and I had allowed myself to be treated badly because I thought that was what being a good mother meant. In the weeks before my birthday, things started to feel strange because Reggie suddenly began calling more often and insisted I celebrate at his house, saying Chelsea was planning something special and the children wanted to see me, and I believed him because I wanted so badly to feel included again. Pet helped me get ready that evening, lending me a nice shawl, fixing my hair and telling me I looked lovely, but she also warned me not to stay silent if something felt wrong and reminded me that I deserved better, even though I laughed it off and said it was just a family dinner. On the way there, a strange feeling sat in my stomach, like my body knew something my heart didn't want to accept yet, and when I arrived everything looked perfect on the surface, with soft music, expensive food and smiles that felt a little too practiced. Reggie's welcome was overly cheerful, Chelsea's greeting was overly sweet, and even the children's quick hugs felt rushed, and as I sat at that huge table I somehow felt more alone than I ever did in my small apartment. Then Vivian arrived, my sister whom I hadn't expected and who Reggie clearly hadn't planned for, and without knowing it she was about to uncover everything he had tried so hard to hide. What I didn't realize then was that the story had already started weeks earlier, while I was still living my simple routine and getting by on a small monthly income, believing life would somehow improve on its own, and it was on a quiet Tuesday afternoon as I sat watching the news, that Reggie called me at an unusual time, and that alone should have told me something important was about to change. His calls never lasted more than a few minutes and this one was no different, but something about his voice felt off, like he was trying too hard to sound relaxed while hiding his nerves. He asked how I was. I said I was fine, and then he quickly brought up my birthday, the 75th one, which I honestly hadn't even been thinking about because to me it was just another quiet day and another reminder of how small my life had become. When he suggested a dinner at his house and said Chelsea and the children wanted to be there, I was shocked because they had never done anything like that before. And I even told him not to bother, that I didn't need anything, but he insisted in a way that made me both hopeful and a little uncomfortable. I finally agreed, telling myself that maybe this time he truly wanted to spend time with me, and when he said he would send a car to pick me up and ended the call quickly, I just sat there holding the phone, wondering why this was happening now and what had suddenly changed. Over the next few days I couldn't stop thinking about that dinner, letting myself imagine that maybe our relationship could improve and that maybe he had finally remembered everything I had done for him. Then a week later he called again, sounding more tense, and asked if I had spoken to my sister Vivian recently, which surprised me because we only talked every few months, and when I said no, he brushed it off and said it would be better if the dinner stayed small and private, just close family. I agreed, of course, but after that call a strange worry stayed with me because I couldn't understand why he cared so much about whether Vivian would be there, and when I later mentioned it to Pet over tea, she could tell right away that something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. When I told Pet that Reggie wanted to organize a birthday dinner for me, I also admitted that something in his voice sounded strange and nervous, and she immediately put her cup down and looked at me with a seriousness that made my heart tighten as she asked if I truly trusted my son. I said yes, of course I did, because he was my son, even though she gently reminded me that he rarely visited, that I was living on almost nothing while he lived in comfort, and that I was always the one counting coins just to buy simple food. I defended him like I always did, telling her he did what he could and that it was a mother's duty to stand by her child. But she asked me a question that shook me deeply: what if he wasn't helping me at all? And what if some of my problems were actually because of him? I begged her not to say that, feeling tears in my eyes, and she took my hand and told me that I was too kind for my own good and that kind people often get taken advantage of, not because others are always bad, but because they don't question things enough. Her words stayed in my mind for days, and even though I tried to tell myself she was wrong, I started lying awake at night wondering why Reggie lived so well while I had so little, why my husband's long years of work had left me with almost nothing, and why I had never been shown any of the paperwork. One afternoon, driven by a quiet fear I couldn't ignore anymore, I opened the old box of documents in my closet and searched through papers and memories until I found a folder from my husband's funeral. And inside it was a letter from a lawyer addressed to Reggie with a name and phone number, Elias Carter. I didn't fully understand what the letter said, but I held it for a long time, unsure if I had the right to question anything, and in the end I slipped it into my bag and carried it around for days without calling, feeling like I was holding something dangerous. Then, on the Friday before my birthday, Reggie suddenly appeared at my apartment without warning, and my heart told me that something important was about to happen. That kind of unannounced visit was completely out of character for Reggie, so when I heard a knock at the door, my heart nearly leapt out of my chest. "Son, what a surprise," I said, opening the door to see him standing there, looking around my tiny apartment as if he had never been inside before, as if the reality of my small, worn-down space had only just hit him. "Mama, I need to talk to you," he said immediately, still standing, clearly tense. "Did something happen? Are you okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Yes. I just wanted to confirm you'll be at the dinner on Tuesday." "It's important," he replied, running a hand through his hair, sweating despite the cool air. He asked if anyone had called me about my husband or money matters, warning me about scammers pretending to offer inheritances. My stomach tightened. No one had called. I said as much, and he left quickly, kissing my forehead and disappearing down the hall, leaving a strange heaviness behind. That night, sleep eluded me entirely. I turned the strange visit over and over in my mind. The urgency, the warnings, the insistence on the dinner. The next day, I retrieved the folder with the attorney's contact and stared at it for hours, my hands shaking as I finally picked up the phone. A secretary answered at Carter Law Group, and after what felt like an eternity, Elias Carter himself came on the line. "Mrs. Ames, this is Elias Carter." "What a surprise," he said. I almost faltered but managed to ask, voice trembling, about my husband's papers, mentioning he had helped us all after Jeremiah's death. A long, heavy silence followed when I asked about the trust fund, so long that I feared the line had dropped. My chest tightened, my hands went cold, and I realized that the next moments might change everything. The attorney's words echoed in my mind, serious and heavy. "Mrs. Ames, we need to talk urgently." My birthday morning arrived gray and quiet, as if the world itself sensed the storm I was trying to ignore. I woke far earlier than necessary, unable to stop thinking about Elias Carter's call, about the things he said I needed to know, things that should have been revealed 5 years ago. I told him to wait until after my dinner, hoping, I suppose, that maybe this was all a mistake, that Reggie hadn't betrayed me. Mid-morning, Pet knocked with a small cake and a single candle. "You don't spend a birthday without blowing out at least one candle," she said softly. We sat together in my living room, eating the tiny cake with watery coffee, the silence between us heavy but comforting. She watched me closely, her eyes full of concern. "What's wrong?" I asked. I told her about the call, about the uneasy feeling that something terrible was about to come to light. She set her plate down and looked me in the eye. "Delilah, listen carefully. Tonight, no matter what happens, don't stay quiet. If anything feels wrong, speak up. Someone disrespects you, leave. You owe nothing to anyone, especially not to the person who has always made you feel small." I whispered, "He's my son." He squeezed my hand. "Yes, he's your son. But you're his mother. You gave him everything, your time, your energy, even your wedding ring to secure his future. Don't let him make you feel like you owe him thanks." Her words sank deep. She hugged me tightly, told me to call her when I got home, and left. I was alone, staring at the clock, the minutes crawling, torturous in their slowness. I bathed, put on the only decent dress I owned, a faded brown one with no holes, and styled my hair in the mirror. I saw myself, tired, worn, but still standing, preparing for a night that could change everything. 75 years, an entire lifetime, and for what? To spend it alone in a tiny apartment, waiting for my son to toss me scraps of attention once a year. At 7 o'clock, the ride-share arrived. The driver was polite and friendly, asking if I was heading to a celebration. "Yes," I said quietly, "it's my birthday." He smiled warmly, wished me a happy birthday, and I thanked him, though I didn't tell him how heavy my heart felt, like I was walking to my own funeral. When the car stopped in front of Reggie's house, my stomach twisted. 3 stories of luxury glared at me, perfectly landscaped gardens, shiny expensive cars, everything so far from the tiny world I survived in. Chelsea opened the door in a dress that probably cost more than 6 months of my rent. Her smile was flawless, rehearsed, as she offered air kisses and said, "Delilah, happy birthday. So glad you made it." The aroma of shrimp, fresh bread, and fine wine filled the air, reminding me of everything I'd never been able to afford. Inside, Reggie stood with the children. He hugged me, but it was hollow, a gesture of obligation. The grandchildren barely looked up, muttering a quick, "Hi, Grandma," before returning to their screens. Chelsea poured wine, insisting I try a glass, and I refused, choosing water, though she pressed with a polite urgency. Reggie fidgeted, checking his phone every couple of minutes, speaking in forced, shallow sentences, asking about my health, commenting on the weather. Nothing genuine. I counted the minutes, wishing the dinner would end, when suddenly the doorbell rang. Reggie went pale, Chelsea nearly dropped her glass, and both exchanged a panicked glance I couldn't read. "Are you expecting someone else?" I asked. "No," Reggie said, too quickly, too sharply, and the tension in the room made my chest tighten. It must be a mistake, I thought, but the doorbell rang again, louder this time. Chelsea went to answer, and I immediately recognized the voice that followed, even though months had passed since I last heard it. My sister Vivian entered the living room like a force of nature, elegant and commanding in a gray tailored suit, high heels, perfect hair, and the faint scent of expensive perfume. She carried a large gift wrapped in gold paper and a bottle of wine, and the moment she saw me, she ran forward and hugged me tightly, real and strong, not the polite gestures I'd grown used to. "Happy birthday, sister. 75 years, what an incredible milestone," she exclaimed. Shock left me speechless. "Vivian, I didn't know you were coming," I managed. "I wanted it to be a surprise," she replied, smiling. "Reggie told me you were having a birthday dinner and I couldn't miss it. 75 doesn't happen every day." I glanced at Reggie. His expression betrayed him. He hadn't expected her at all and clearly hadn't told her anything. "Aunt Vivian, what a surprise," he stammered, his voice tight. "Exactly why it's a surprise, nephew," she said, taking my hand as she sat beside me. "How are you, Delilah? You look thinner." I forced a smile. "I'm fine." "Are you sure? Eating well? Do you have enough?" Her questions were piercing, not because they were rude but because they were real, touching the truth I'd kept hidden for years. I nodded quickly. Yes, everything is fine." Vivian gave me a look that said she didn't quite believe me, but she didn't push. Instead, she turned to Reggie and Chelsea, her tone smooth but deliberate. "What a beautiful house. Every time I visit, I'm more amazed. How's business, Reggie?" "Good. Everything's going well," he said, uneasy. "I'm glad, because I know maintaining this lifestyle isn't simple. Private schools, cars, this house. It all costs a lot. But with the investments you made, I assume you've done very well." Reggie cleared his throat nervously. "I've been lucky. Luck helps. But so does the initial capital, right?" The room grew tense, though I couldn't yet understand why. Vivian seemed to be playing a game whose rules only she knew. Chelsea returned from the kitchen, announcing that dinner was ready. We moved to the enormous dining room, a polished wooden table set for 12, fine china, silver cutlery, crisp cloth napkins. Everything elegant, every detail far from the life I knew. They seated me at the head of the table, the guest of honor, though I still felt the quiet weight of unease pressing in. Vivian sat to my right, her presence calm but commanding. Reggie and Chelsea faced me across the table, looking tense, while the children sat quietly at the ends, bored and fidgeting. The meal was flawless. Salads with ingredients I didn't recognize, baked salmon, herb-roasted potatoes, and expensive wine. Everyone sipped except me. Polite conversation floated around the table, but it felt hollow, nothing real, nothing that mattered. Then Vivian set her fork down, took a long sip of wine, and fixed me with a look I couldn't read. "Delilah, there's something I've been meaning to ask," she said slowly. "Are you enjoying your $500,000 trust fund?" The words hit me like a thunderclap. $500,000. Trust fund. My heart raced, my ears rang, and for a moment the world outside that dining room didn't exist. "What trust fund are you talking about?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Vivian's frown deepened. "The trust fund your husband Jeremiah set up for you before he passed. I witnessed him sign the papers. $500,000 so you could live comfortably, so you would never lack for anything in your later years." Tears stung my eyes. I don't know anything about that," I murmured. Vivian set her glass down with a dry thud, her face hardening. She was no longer my gentle sister. She had become the sharp, unstoppable businesswoman I knew she could be. She turned to Reggie and Chelsea. "What did you do with the money?" she demanded. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy, almost tangible. Reggie and Chelsea froze completely as if turned to stone, while my grandchildren glanced around, confused, unsure what was happening. Deep down, I already knew the truth. The truth I had been avoiding for years, since Reggie's strange calls, his sudden visits, and the attorney's warnings. "Aunt Vivian," Reggie stammered, voice shaking, "I think there's a misunderstanding here." "There is no misunderstanding," Vivian cut him off sharply. "I was present when your father signed those documents. $500,000 was placed in an irrevocable trust for Delilah, with guaranteed monthly payments of $4,000 for life. Everything was legal, everything protected, so she would never have to worry about money again." My chest tightened and I felt a mix of shock, rage, and the bitter realization that for years I had been living in poverty while my own son had taken what was rightfully mine. $4,000 a month. I had been surviving on just $750. The numbers refused to make sense in my head, like they belonged to two different lives that should never have crossed. Reggie finally looked at me and said, "Mama, let me explain," but Vivian stopped him with a firm gesture. She looked straight at him and asked the questions I had been too afraid to say out loud. Where the money was, why his mother was living in a tiny, unhappy apartment on a small pension, and why I had never even heard about any trust. Chelsea jumped up so fast her chair almost tipped over and rushed out, saying she needed the restroom, and the children quickly asked to leave too. Reggie told them to go, and suddenly it was just the three of us. Vivian burning with anger, Reggie shaking with fear, and me sitting there feeling my life fall apart piece by piece. I heard my own voice ask, almost like it belonged to someone else, "Reggie, is what your aunt is saying true?" He wiped his face, his hands trembling, and said it was complicated, but Vivian cut him off and demanded a simple answer. After a long, painful silence, he finally admitted in a small voice that he had known all along. That word, known, hit me harder than anything else that night. I asked him through tears why I had been kept in the dark, and he said his father had put him in charge of managing the money and that he wanted to invest it and grow it for the future. For whose future? Vivian snapped, reminding him that the money was meant for me, not for him. He tried to say he planned to give it to me someday, but something inside me broke at that moment and I finally shouted the questions I had kept buried for years. When was that day supposed to come? After I couldn't pay my rent, after I had to sell my things just to get by, after I spent 5 years feeling like a burden while he lived comfortably using what was meant to take care of me. Vivian pulled out her phone with that sharp, no-nonsense look I knew so well. "I'm calling Elias Carter right now," she said firmly. "He has all the documents, all the proof, and we are going to settle this once and for all." Reggie's face went pale. "Auntie, wait," he pleaded, his voice tight. "It's not necessary." Vivian ignored him and started dialing. "Oh yes, it is necessary. Very necessary." Reggie turned to me, his eyes full of desperation. "Mama, please, we can fix this ourselves. No need for attorneys." I looked at him, anger rising, and asked, "Fix it how? By giving me scraps when it suits you? By keeping me in the dark all these years?" Chelsea came back into the dining room, her eyes red and swollen, standing by the door like she might flee at any moment. Vivian held the phone to her ear. "Elias, this is Vivian Ellington. I'm here with my sister Delilah. We need you to come immediately." "Yes, it's about the Jeremiah Ames Trust Fund." She hung up and turned to us, calm but commanding. "He's coming here. All the documents, every piece of proof. Tonight this ends." Chelsea let out a high, anxious voice. "You can't do this. This is our house and that's my sister's money." Vivian's gaze cut through her. "The money you took," she said flatly. Reggie tried weakly. "We didn't steal anything. I was the legal administrator." Vivian stepped closer, her voice ice cold. "You were meant to manage it for your mother's benefit, not your own. Do you know what that's called? Embezzlement, fraud, theft. Crimes that can land you in prison." Reggie turned even paler. "I didn't want to hurt Mama. I just thought I could invest it, make it grow." Vivian's eyes narrowed. "And did you grow it? Where is the original $500,000 plus 5 years of gains?" From where I was sitting, everything became clear. The house, the cars, Chelsea's designer clothes. All of it had been paid for with my money while I scraped by on less than $800 a month. I felt like I was watching someone else's life, like a movie I couldn't turn off. My own son had lied to me, robbed me, and let me suffer while living in luxury at my expense. I finally spoke, my voice unervingly calm after years of fear and worry. "Reggie," I said, "look me in the eyes. Did you ever feel guilty? In these 5 years, did it ever occur to you that I was living alone in that tiny apartment while you slept in a bed bought with my money? He avoided my gaze and silence filled the room. Then I turned to Chelsea. And you? She barely nodded as if ashamed even to admit it. You too, I said, rising from my chair, my tears flowing but my voice steady. You watched me struggle. You saw me count pennies, wear the same clothes, turn down invitations I couldn't afford, and you did nothing. You let me believe I was a burden while taking what was mine. I paused, the weight of 5 years of humiliation pressing down on me. The worst part, I continued, is not just that you stole the money. It's that you stole my dignity. You made me feel useless, like an old woman good for nothing, and you expected gratitude for crumbs while knowing the truth all along. Reggie tried to reach for me but I raised my hand. Don't touch me. He stammered, Mama, I can give it back. I swear I can make it right. Vivian cut in sharply. With what? If it's all spent on this life of luxury, where will you get $500,000 plus 5 years of monthly payments? We're talking more than $700,000. The number made my head spin. $700,000 that should have been mine. At that moment the doorbell rang. Vivian went to answer it and returned with a serious-looking man in his 60s, wearing a dark suit and carrying a leather briefcase. Good evening, he said, his voice firm. I am Elias Carter. I'm sorry we're meeting like this, Mrs. Ames, the lawyer said gently when he arrived, and as I stood up my legs trembled so badly I had to steady myself. I told him we had spoken on the phone and he nodded, admitting that he deeply regretted not insisting on meeting me in person 5 years earlier because he had assumed my son had explained everything to me. He opened his briefcase and placed a thick folder on the dining table, saying that everything was inside: the will, the trust papers, and all the signed documents. As he flipped through the pages, my eyes filled with tears, but I could still see the numbers clearly. $500,000, monthly payments of $4,000, and my name written everywhere as the only person meant to receive it. He explained that my husband had been very clear that this money was only for me, and while Reggie was allowed to manage it, he was legally required to send me those payments every month without exception. Using that money for anything else, he said, was a serious crime. Reggie collapsed into a chair and Chelsea quietly cried, while I stood there staring at the papers that proved the greatest betrayal of my life. The lawyer spread the documents across the table, and each page felt like another piece of the lie I had been living for 5 long years. My mind struggled to accept it all. Then he asked me calmly if I had ever received any of the monthly payments, and I told him no, that I didn't even know the fund existed. When he asked if anyone had ever explained my husband's will to me, I told him Reggie had said there were debts, that the house had to be sold, and that only a small pension was left. The lawyer shook his head and said there were no debts at all, and that the house sale, the savings, and the insurance money together made up the $500,000 trust fund, and every single dollar of it had been meant for me. I sank into the chair, barely able to keep myself upright, my legs refusing to support me as the weight of the truth hit. The lawyer continued, explaining that my husband had left detailed instructions to sell the house and add its value to the trust so I could live comfortably on $4,000 a month, without ever worrying about money. $4,000 a month for 5 years. I did the quick math in my head. $240,000. I had never seen $240,000 my son had spent while I counted pennies for bread. Elias turned to Reggie. Where is the money? He asked. My son buried his face in his hands, muttering that he had invested it. In the house, in the business, in the children's schools, in everything. Do you have records? Bank statements? Anything showing these investments were meant to benefit your mother? Silence. The attorney tried again. Can you return the original $500,000 plus the monthly payments owed to your mother? Still nothing. Chelsea sobbed openly now, while Vivian looked on with disgust. He can't, she said coldly. He spent it all on luxuries, appearances, a life that wasn't his to live. Elias pulled out bank statements pointing out transfers. $50,000 for a down payment on the house, $100,000 for renovations, $30,000 for a car, and little by little, nearly all the principal vanished within 2 years. The remaining 3 years were drained through loans, transfers, and other small deductions that added up to devastating totals. We realized? I repeated in disbelief, shaking. You knew all this. Elias lowered his gaze, looking ashamed for the first time. I knew Reggie was moving funds. Technically, he had authorization as administrator, and I assumed you were aware and in agreement. I never imagined you had no idea. Why didn't you check with me? His voice was heavy with regret. I tried to keep my own voice calm, though it trembled with anger. I should have, he admitted. It's my responsibility and I apologize. But Reggie assured me many times that you were well cared for, that you were living with them, and that you didn't need monthly payments because he was covering your expenses. I stared at Reggie, a mix of horror and disgust twisting inside me. You told him I was living with you? I shouted, my voice cracking. Reggie couldn't even look at me. You lied to the attorney, saying you were taking care of me while I was alone, eating canned soup. His face went pale and he muttered something about eventually bringing me to live with them. Eventually. In 10 more years. Never. Another lie. Chelsea finally spoke, her voice shrill and weak. We wanted to help, Delilah, but expenses. The children, the house. It wasn't personal. Vivian laughed, sharp and bitter, a sound full of contempt. Not personal. So stealing from an elderly woman is justified because your children go to private schools. Chelsea's protest was feeble. We didn't steal. Elias spoke, calm but firm. Yes, you did. Misappropriation of fiduciary funds, fraud, financial abuse of an elder. All criminal acts in addition to civil liability. Fear washed over Reggie's face. Criminal? But I'm her son, she won't press charges. Everyone turned to me. I didn't answer. Too many emotions collided at once. Pain, rage, betrayal, but also something new. Power, the sense that I finally held control. What remains of the trust fund? Vivian asked. Elias checked his papers. Approximately $30,000 remains. $30,000 out of $500,000. My husband's lifelong efforts, destroyed in less than 5 years. And what are her options? Vivian pressed. Elias adjusted his glasses. Several. She can file a civil lawsuit to recover the funds, including damages. For the first time in years, I felt the tide turning. I was no longer helpless. I was no longer invisible. The fight to reclaim my life had just begun. He explained that I had several choices. I could file a criminal case for fraud and misuse of funds, or I could try to reach a private agreement with my son to get the money back. Vivian asked what he recommended, and he said it depended on what I wanted. If I wanted my money back faster, a private settlement might work, but if I wanted real justice and consequences, the legal route was better, even if it took longer. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, everything looked perfect. The trimmed lawn, the quiet street, the beautiful houses. But to me it all felt fake, a pretty picture built from my pain and my stolen life. Reggie stood behind me and begged me to talk to him, asking what I wanted him to do. I turned slowly and looked into his eyes, the same eyes that once looked at me with love, now filled only with fear. I told him I wanted the truth for the first time in 5 years and asked if he had planned this from the start, if he already knew he would keep my money after his father passed away. He said no, that at first he only took a little for the house and planned to return it, but one expense became another and things went out of control. I asked why he never told me, why he never gave me even a small part of what was mine, and he admitted he was afraid I would be angry and judge him, so instead he chose silence. I told him that meant he chose my suffering over his honesty, that he decided I didn't need much, that I was fine with a simple life. That word hurt more than anything. Did he really think I was happy struggling, wearing old clothes and feeling like a burden every time I needed a little help? When he called me Mama, something inside me broke and I told him in a calm but firm voice, "Don't call me that." To him I realized being a mother meant being used and discarded, my sacrifices worth nothing, someone he could lie to and take from without a second thought. Chelsea approached cautiously, her voice trembling. She begged me to think about the children, warning that if this went public or became a trial, they would suffer and lose their father. I stared at her, disbelief and anger welling up. You're asking me to think of your children? You who never once thought of me. What will you tell them when they ask why their father is in trouble? That he stole from their grandmother and she had the nerve to stand up for herself. Vivian stood beside me, calm and steady. You don't have to decide anything right now, Delilah. Take your time and think carefully about what you want. Elias closed his briefcase, his expression serious. I'll prepare a full report for you, Mrs. Ames. Bank movements, transfers, everything documented. Then you can decide how to proceed. I asked how long I had to decide and he explained that legally there were several years, but the sooner I acted the better my chances of recovering the money. My head was spinning. I needed air, needed to be alone to process it all. I'm leaving, I said firmly. Vivian offered to drive immediately and I accepted. Reggie stepped forward pleading, Mama, wait. Don't leave like this. We can talk more. I cut him off. You did what you did. Now I will do what I have to do. I walked toward the door, Vivian following, Elias gathering his papers. Before stepping out, I glanced back at Reggie standing in the middle of his luxurious living room, surrounded by everything he had taken from me, and I felt no pity, only clarity. Happy birthday to me, I said quietly and I left. The ride was silent. Vivian focused on the road while I stared out the window, watching the city lights blur as tears streamed down my face. Soft, quiet tears that held years of pain, betrayal, and the first taste of freedom. That I wasn't crying loudly, I was just letting the tears fall while my mind tried to understand everything that had just happened, because my 75th birthday had turned into the worst and most eye-opening night of my life, the night I learned that for 5 years I had been betrayed by my own son. Vivian asked gently if she should take me back to my apartment, and I whispered yes, and we drove in silence for about 15 minutes until we reached my building. She turned off the engine and asked if she should come up with me, but I told her no, that I needed to be alone, even though she insisted I shouldn't be by myself after such a shock. I told her I had already been alone for 5 years, and one more night wouldn't make much difference. She sighed and made me promise to call her if I needed anything at any time, and I nodded before stepping out of the car. My legs felt heavy as if I were carrying a lifetime on my back, and I climbed the stairs slowly, one step at a time, struggling even to put the key in the lock because my hands were shaking so badly. When I entered, I looked at my apartment as if seeing it for the first time, the small room, the narrow kitchen, the bathroom with the leaking pipes, the whole sad place that had been my world while my son lived in luxury. I sat on my old sofa and finally broke down, crying harder than I had since my husband died, crying for the 5 stolen years, for the nights I went to bed hungry, for the shame of not being able to buy proper gifts, for every moment I felt useless and in the way, but also crying from anger, and anger I had carried my whole life, anger at a world that taught me to stay quiet, at a life that taught me to endure, and at myself for never asking questions. I don't know how long I sat there in the dark, but eventually there was a knock on the door, and it was Pet holding 2 cups of hot tea and telling me she wouldn't take no for an answer. We sat together on the sofa and she didn't push me to talk, she just waited, and after one sip I told her everything, every detail, every truth, every betrayal, and when I finished she took my hands, looked at me gently and said, Delilah, do you realize what really happened to you tonight? I told Pet that yes, I had discovered my son had taken my money, but something even more important had happened too, because for the first time in my life I had stopped staying silent and had finally asked questions and demanded honest answers. And she looked at me and said that this was where real change begins. I told her I didn't feel brave at all, that I felt broken, but she said being broken is not the same as being weak, and that sometimes a person has to fall apart before they can rebuild their life in a better and more honest way, without lies and without carrying everyone else's expectations. Her words stayed with me because she was right. Something inside me had shifted that night, and I hadn't only found out the truth, I had also found my own voice. The voice I had buried for 75 years because I was taught that good women don't complain, good mothers accept everything, and good wives never argue. When she asked me what I was going to do next, I told her I didn't know yet, that the lawyer would send me all the papers and that I had choices to make, but I didn't know which one I could face. Then she asked me which choice scared me the most, and that question made me think deeply because it wasn't just about taking my son to court or exposing him. What truly frightened me was something else. I admitted that I was afraid of being independent, afraid of having my own money, afraid of not needing him anymore, because then I would no longer have an excuse to stay quiet, to stay small, and to accept almost nothing as if it were enough. Pet gave me a sad smile and said that was exactly what I needed to confront, and after she left I stayed awake in the dark, thinking about my whole life, remembering the little girl who wanted to become a teacher but was told girls shouldn't study too much, the young woman who wanted to work but was told her place was at home, and the mother who was told to rest because others would take care of everything. All my life had been shaped by other people's voices, and I had obeyed because I thought that was what love looked like. But that night I finally understood that giving everything and receiving nothing is not love. It is slowly destroying yourself, and I had been doing exactly that for 75 years. In the days that followed, everything felt strange and heavy. and when Elias Carter sent me the thick folders of documents, page after page showing every transfer, every withdrawal, and every lie written in numbers and dates, I realized there was no denying the truth anymore and no way to go back to the person I had been before. Vivian came to see me every day, patiently helping me go through the papers, explaining the legal words I didn't understand and reminding me again and again that none of this was my fault and that the responsibility belonged entirely to Reggie. Meanwhile, Reggie kept calling and leaving messages, sometimes begging, sometimes promising to return everything, sometimes crying and asking me to forgive him, but I couldn't bring myself to answer because my heart wasn't ready yet. Chelsea called too, but her messages felt different, full of excuses and quiet pressure, telling me not to think about myself, telling me to think about the family and the children, as if I still owed them something after everything that had happened. In the afternoons, Pet would come over and we would sit together with tea talking about small things and big things, and she told me stories about her own life, about how she had also been disappointed by her children at times and how she had learned to draw lines, to say no, and to finally choose herself without feeling ashamed. One day she said something that stayed with me, that our generation was taught to accept nothing for ourselves while the younger generation was taught they could have everything, and that both ideas were unfair in their own way. About a week after my birthday, Vivian came over and told me she had spoken with Elias and that they had thought of a plan, one that could help me recover my money and also my self-respect, one that would make Reggie face the results of his actions without hurting the children, who had nothing to do with any of this. She explained everything to me carefully and I could see that the plan was smart and balanced, but it also meant I would have to stay strong, not step back and not let guilt or old habits push me into giving up. I asked out loud if I was really capable of doing it and she told me I was, but only if I truly wanted to, and that no one would blame me if I chose to let everything go because the choice had to be mine. When I asked her what she would do, she looked at me and said honestly that she couldn't decide for me, because she hadn't lived in my place, hadn't sold her things to survive, and hadn't spent years being made to feel small while someone else lived comfortably. That night I couldn't sleep and I walked slowly around my little apartment, thinking about every possible future, weighing every fear and every hope, and when the morning light finally appeared, I knew what my decision was, and for the first time in many years I felt calm and certain, not because anyone had told me what to do, but because I finally trusted my own voice, and I stood in front of the bathroom mirror knowing something inside me had truly changed. That I studied the woman in the mirror and saw someone who was 75 with deep lines on her face, white hair and hands shaped by a lifetime of working for others. But this time I also noticed something new in her eyes, a quiet confidence that had never been there before, a calm strength that doesn't come from arguing or demanding, but from finally understanding your own value and refusing to let anyone ignore it again. I told myself that I didn't need to speak louder to be heard, I just needed to stop making myself smaller, and with that thought I picked up the phone and called Elias Carter, and when he answered I said the words I had been afraid to say for years, that I was ready to move forward, to reclaim what was mine, and to do it properly with fairness and self-respect without turning away this time. 3 days later, Reggie and Chelsea were sitting across from me in Elias's office, in a meeting he had arranged as a last chance to settle things calmly before taking bigger steps, and one that I fully controlled. Reggie looked worn out and tired, and Chelsea sat stiffly with her arms folded, trying to look wronged, while Vivian sat beside me and Elias sat behind his desk with stacks of papers ready. And for the first time I felt steady and prepared. Elias explained that the goal was to avoid a long and expensive process if possible, but Reggie tried to speak right away and apologize, and I gently stopped him and told him that this time he would listen first. I told him, in a clear and steady voice, that for 5 years he had hidden the truth from me, that he had let me struggle while he lived comfortably, that he had made me feel like I should be grateful for almost nothing, and that all that time he knew exactly what he was doing and still chose to stay silent. When he tried to interrupt, I told him I wasn't finished and I explained that he had been given many chances to do the right thing, many chances to be honest, and every time he chose the easier path for himself instead, and that from this moment on, things would no longer be done his way because now the decisions were finally in my hands. Now it was my turn to decide. Elias laid several folders on the table and calmly explained the 3 paths in front of us. The first was a civil case, a lawsuit to recover everything that had been taken along with interest and compensation, which would come close to $800,000. Reggie's face drained of color and he said he didn't have that kind of money, and Vivian answered without hesitation that then he would sell the house, sell the cars, sell everything, and if it still wasn't enough he would spend the rest of his working life paying what he owed. The second option, Elias continued, was a criminal case, with charges that could send him to prison for many years. Chelsea began to cry and said the children needed their father, and I replied quietly that children also needed to learn that even terrible choices have consequences. The third option was a private agreement, one written in strict legal terms, where he would return the money under conditions I set, and if he failed even once, the civil and criminal cases would begin immediately. Reggie asked in a broken voice what those conditions would be, and Elias looked at me, giving me the floor. I said that the house would be sold because it had been bought with my money and no longer belonged to them. Chelsea panicked and asked where they were supposed to live, and I told her they would live where they could afford, the same way I had been forced to do for 5 years. I said they would also sell the investment accounts and the luxury car and transfer every possible dollar into a new account in my name under Elias's supervision. When Reggie said it still wouldn't be enough because of debts in the mortgage, I told him he would work and pay the rest back, $3,000 a month if necessary for as long as it took, all written into a legal contract with interest, and that if he missed even one payment I would move forward without hesitation. Chelsea said it was impossible and that they had expenses, and Vivian cut her off and said the children could attend ordinary schools like millions of others, and that no one had ever died from not having private lessons or luxury comforts. That I added firmly, "There's one more thing. You will tell your children the truth. You will explain exactly what you did and why it was wrong so they understand that stealing, even from family, is never acceptable. Especially from family." Tears streamed down Reggie's face. "Mama, are you going to ruin my family?" he whispered. "No," I said, steady and unshakable. "You ruined it when you stole from me. I'm only reclaiming what is mine. If your family suffers because of it, that's because it was built on lies from the start." Elias slid the documents toward him. "You have 2 choices," he said. "Sign this agreement now or we meet in court next week. The decision is yours." Reggie stared at the papers, at Chelsea, at Vivian, and then at me, searching for the forgiving mother who had once let everything slide. But that mother no longer existed. "Sign," I said, "or face the full consequences of your actions." With shaking hands, Reggie took the pen. Every page reminded him of his betrayal. Every clause was a promise to repay what he had taken. Chelsea had to sign as well as a co-debtor. Together they committed to selling the house, liquidating the accounts, returning the money, making monthly payments and facing legal consequences if they failed. When it was done, Elias collected the papers. "These are legally binding," he said. "You have 30 days to sell the property and transfer the initial funds. Monthly payments start the next month." Reggie stayed seated, defeated and hollow, while I felt not triumph but a profound exhaustion. The weight of 75 years of expectations and silence finally lifting. I looked at him and asked, "Is there anything else you want to say to me?" His voice was barely audible. "Will you ever forgive me?" "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Maybe, maybe not. That no longer depends on you. You did what you did. Now I will live my life, with or without your repentance." I stood and Vivian walked beside me. Together we left that office, leaving behind a son who had learned the hardest lesson of his life. That mothers too have limits. That love doesn't mean tolerating abuse. Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting or allowing it to happen again. Outside, the sun was shining warm and bright, and for the first time in 5 years, I could enjoy it without the shadow of money worries hanging over me. "How do you feel?" Vivian asked. "Free," I said quietly. "Finally free." 6 months later, I sat on the balcony of my new apartment, savoring real coffee made from freshly ground beans, the kind I had always admired but never allowed myself to buy. The apartment wasn't huge, but it was mine. 2 bedrooms, a fully working kitchen, a proper bathroom, and this balcony where I could watch the sunrise every morning. I had rented it with the money recovered from the sale of Reggie's house. Elias had handled everything perfectly. The house sold in 3 weeks, the mortgage and debts were cleared, and $200,000 went straight into my account. The cars were sold, the accounts liquidated. Altogether I had recovered nearly $300,000. It wasn't the full $500,000, but it was more than enough for a 75-year-old woman who only wanted peace and dignity. Elias reinvested the money into a new trust fund, with me as the sole administrator. No one else could touch it or make decisions about my life. The monthly payments of $2,500 arrived like clockwork, and Reggie was still sending his $3,000 monthly as required. Vivian visited often. Sometimes we went out for lunch at nice restaurants. Other times we just walked in the park talking about life, about choices, and about finding strength in quiet confidence. She had taught me that being strong isn't about yelling. It's about knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone take it away. And Pet remained my steadfast friend. We no longer lived in the same building, but we saw each other almost every day. We shared tea, stories, laughter, and silence. She had shown me that true friendship doesn't depend on blood. It depends on respect, honesty, and the willingness to stand by each other through life's storms. For the first time in decades, I felt the warmth of being valued, of being seen, and of living life on my own terms. Reggie and I didn't speak much. He called maybe once a month. Short, awkward conversations that felt heavy with unspoken words. He would tell me they'd moved into a smaller apartment, that Chelsea had found a job, that the children were adjusting to public school. Occasionally he asked how I was. I answered in monosyllables. I hadn't forgiven him and I wasn't sure I ever would. But something more important had changed. I had found peace. Peace with what had happened, peace with the decisions I had made, and most importantly, peace with myself. The grandchildren sent me occasional texts, brief and uncertain. Reggie had softened the truth for them, explaining that he had made mistakes with Grandma's money and was trying to make things right. They didn't fully understand, but that was okay. They would one day. I started allowing myself to do things I had long denied myself. I took painting classes and discovered a surprising talent for landscapes. Nothing professional, just enough to make me happy. I joined a book club at the neighborhood library, a group of women my age who met once a week to talk about books and life. Many had experienced disappointment, betrayal, or neglect from their children or families. Together we were learning to live for ourselves after decades of living for others. One afternoon, while painting on my balcony, the phone rang. An unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. "Mrs. Ames?" a young woman's voice asked. "Yes, this is she. My name is Maria. I'm a social worker at the community center. One of the women in your book club shared your story, and we were wondering if you'd consider speaking to other older women who are experiencing financial abuse by family members." I stayed silent, processing her words. "You don't have to decide right now," Maria added. "We just believe your story could help them find their voice and understand they're not alone." "Let me think about it," I said. That night I couldn't sleep. For 75 years I had been silent, invisible. Now I might speak publicly, share my story, and help others reclaim their dignity. The next day I told Vivian about the call. She smiled at me knowingly, the same steady, encouraging smile that had guided me through so many difficult decisions. And for the first time in decades I felt that my voice, my life, and my choices truly mattered. She smiled. "Remember what I told you months ago? Sometimes you have to fall apart to rebuild yourself the right way. You fell apart. You rebuilt yourself. And now you can help others do the same." I admitted, "I'm scared." She nodded. "Good. That means it matters. That means it's real." A week later I found myself in a circle of 10 women at the community center, all over 60, all carrying stories of families who had used them, robbed them, or made them feel invisible. I shared my story exactly as it had happened. No softening, no sugarcoating. The trust fund, the betrayal, the poverty, the lies, and also the recovery, the justice, the peace. When I finished, tears filled the room, but there was also hope, recognition, and the understanding that they were not alone, that they had been right to feel what they felt, and that a way forward existed. One timid woman raised her hand. "How did you find the courage to face them?" she asked. "I didn't find it all at once," I admitted. "I built it day by day, choice by choice, decision by decision, by refusing to swallow what was poisoning me. By learning that my voice mattered, my life mattered, that I mattered." Nearly a year has passed since that birthday night, the night that changed everything. I still live in my apartment with the balcony. I still paint and read. I still drink real coffee every morning, savoring it like a small victory. But I also do something more. Twice a month I meet with that group of women. I guide them, explain their rights, accompany them to attorneys, and support them when fear threatens to stop them. I remind them that taking care of themselves is not selfish, that setting boundaries is not cruel, and that dignity is a right no matter age or circumstance. Reggie is still paying. Chelsea is still working. The grandchildren are growing. Maybe one day our relationship will improve. Or maybe it won't. But none of that defines my worth or my happiness anymore. This morning as I sipped my coffee and watched the sunrise, I reflected on the journey. The woman I was a year ago, invisible, quiet, convinced her only value was serving others. And the woman I am now, visible, confident, aware that her value comes simply from existing. I stood and faced the mirror. The same 75-year-old woman stared back. The same wrinkles, the same white hair, but her eyes had changed. They no longer reflected resignation. They reflected strength, clarity, and the quiet certainty that I finally belonged to myself. They reflected peace, strength, purpose. They stole my years and called it care, I whispered to my reflection. But I reclaimed them quietly with truth and courage. I smiled. A real smile, the kind that comes from the soul, because I finally understood something fundamental. Justice is not always loud. Sometimes it is silent. Strength is not always violent. Sometimes it is serene. And freedom doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes it comes from within, from deciding that you deserve more and then doing what is necessary to claim it. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. I would love to hear from you. If this story touched you, you can support me with a super thanks so I can keep sharing more stories like this. Your support means the world. On the screen you can see 2 new life stories I highly recommend. There's so much more waiting for you on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.